already talked about the blade materials. I want to talk about blade shape a little bit. So I'm just going to talk basic principles, not recommending any particular shape over anything else. Uh, Now, the shape of the blade, that's your length, your width, your thickness, and the overall shape. That is going to affect how what kind of damage it will do, what kind of techniques you can use, and then the overall weight and feel. This is a very personal thing, similar to the handle geometry. What techniques do you like? How big are your hands? How strong are you? So forth. So again, I'm just talking general principles in the blade shape and not recommending any particular thing. Okay, first thing we're going to look at is length. That one's pretty easy. Anything under about 4 inches, your penetration depth is limited. You need a minimum of about 4 inches to penetrate into any vital organs. Now, that may not be important if you're simply trying to damage limbs and so forth. You can get by with smaller blades, but your techniques become more limited. This you can slash with, and you can make fairly long slashes with it, but again, you're not going to really reach the vitals with this. You start getting up around 6 inches or so. This was considered sort of the minimum if you're going through heavy clothing and so forth. So about a 6-inch blade is a good working standard. I prefer up to maybe about an 8-inch. Get over about 9-10 inches or so, we're starting to get into short sword territory. It becomes unwieldy. It's hard to carry, or more difficult to carry, I should say. So anything over about 10 inches, like I said, we're getting into short sword, not a knife at that point. It's rather than a weapon of opportunity, something that's easy to carry. This is something like a sword you'd be carrying in a scabbard or across your back, something. So it just becomes heavier and more unwieldy. The thickness of the blade, that's going to determine the strength. Now, you get a fillet knife or a kitchen knife, a thin blade is actually an advantage. You start getting into a fighting knife, because it's going to be, it may be torqued sideways, it may be twisted, it needs to hold up. So you do need a certain amount of spine to it. You do need a certain amount of thickness. Downside to that is increased weight, which for chopping, may not be a bad thing. You may want more weight in the blade for the types of techniques you're using. Now, however, for slicing, stabbing, and so forth, you don't need a lot of weight. So again, it's a balancing act. It becomes personal preference. Now, the thickness of the blade, for example, a very narrow blade, that makes penetration a lot easier. You don't have a lot of blade weight, again, for chopping, and you get more limited in your blade shape as far as for slicing and so forth. Whereas you get something like this, now this is designed for woodworking primarily, not for fighting. But this is an extreme example of quite a point heavy, quite wide at the tip. Very effective for chopping, not so much because it's going to limit, or your penetration is going to be more difficult the more blade material you're having to work with in a stab. So length, width, thickness. Don't want it too wide, don't want it, again, narrow. I mean, you can go all the way down to like an ice pick. Penetration will be fantastic with it. Your wounding capability, not so much. Structural integrity, obviously, it has to be strong, and your blade geometry, your width and thickness and so forth are going to determine that. Again, it's a balancing act. How strong do I want it versus how heavy do I want it? So now, you do have some odd blade shapes. Now, these are all flat blades. And that's sort of the standard for a knife. You can have a round blade, like an ice pick or some of the old medieval rondelles. They were designed for penetrating armor, especially like chainmail or ring armor, or going through the eye slots in a visor, that sort of thing. They were generally used for finishing off rather than actual fighting. Penetration is fantastic. The wound that it leaves behind, not so great. You've got to hit something vital for them to work. You also have some T-shaped. So as you're looking at the blade, and you see this in the churas and the kinjals and some of those, there'll be a T across the back. Now that gives considerable stiffness to the blade. That gives considerable support to the blade. You can maybe have a slightly narrower, or not as thick a blade, but then have the T across the top. It, of course, stiffens the blade considerably, adds some weight. It also increases the wounding capability a little bit in a stab. In a slash, not so much. And of course, if you're trying to slash with the back of the blade, good luck, because it's flat at that point. But when you get that T-shaped wound, whereas a regular blade, the wound can close right back up over it. You get that T-shaped, you're going to get flaps. Similar is the triangular. You see triangular bayonets, you see some old triangular daggers, some Bronze Age short swords that were shaped in a triangle. Again, in a stab, horrific wound, but it becomes heavier and becomes less effective in slashes and so forth. Now there's some extras that you'll see on blades, varying degrees of desirability. Now you'll get what's often called a blood groove in the sides of the blade. Actual technical term is a fuller, and all this does is to lighten. It does nothing for the wounding mechanism, but it does lighten the blade. It allows you to remove some material, get a slightly lighter blade with more blade width. So that's one thing you can do to change the balance on a blade, lighten it up a bit. And it's called a fuller over the smithing tool that you use to put it into the blade. What else we got? Okay, saw teeth. Now we have a couple of different kinds of saw teeth you'll see, usually on like survival blades. One type is designed for sawing wood or bone. In a fight, really doesn't do much. This is again primarily for use as a tool. You can get serrations like this, and this for this particular blade is designed to grab and hang on to, although they will do some damage. Serrations aren't bad. People talk about them being difficult to sharpen. If you're using a narrow crock stick or a sharpening steel, you can maintain the edge on them, no real problem. And even without that, you put it on a standard stone, and the tops will take an edge. Now, another type of saw teeth you'll see is on, like the old Randall No. 18 survival knife, the Air Force survival knife. These are actually not designed for wood; they're designed for aircraft skin. You're in a downed aircraft, helicopter, airplane, whatever. You need to cut through the aluminum body, which is actually remarkably thin on a lot of the older aircraft, especially. And that's what this was designed for. Again, not to cut wood, not to cut bone, not to do damage to your opponent, but to cut through aircraft skin. So those are sort of limited utility. You can also get some that are purely for looks. If you try to cut anything with them, it's pointless, but it does give you maybe a psychological advantage. I don't know. It's decorative more than anything. Now, I do like having a little bit of serrations, especially on my pocket knives down towards the base of the blade. These are handy for cutting nylon line, nylon strapping. They do better than just a straight edge. So I do like having a section of serrations on my pocket knives. But in a fighting knife, again, unless it's something you're going to be grabbing with, this one, grab with it, and that can entangle in clothing, and it does do damage to the skin as you're grabbing. But it's not designed to tear the skin. And to be honest, I'm not really concerned about tearing the skin. A good sharp edge is going to cut the skin, and that's all you really need on that. Okay, gut hooks. And I don't have anything example. A gut hook is designed for dressing out animals. It's designed to limit the penetration. That allows you to cut through the skin without cutting into the internal organs. They maybe look mean, but in a fighting knife, they really don't have any purpose. It's similar to this. You're going to be limiting the depth of penetration, which is not what we're trying to do. So gut hooks, for looks again. Now the point. Okay. So a very narrow point, again, improves penetration. Extreme example, ice pick. You get fantastic penetration with a narrow point. However, it becomes delicate. I mean, you can snap this metal to get it into something, and it can stick in bone. You stick it into bone, you can have a tough time removing it. You get a little duller point, if you will, a little more of an angle to it. Penetration becomes a little more difficult, although not impossible. But it does more damage going in, and it gives more support to the point. You're less likely to break it off, and it's less likely to stick in bone. Something like this wouldn't stick in bone at all, but it also is not going to penetrate bone very well. Now, the point, and again, it can be all the way to rounded, needle point, whatever. Now, how it relates to the handle is important as well. So, this point is directly in line with the handle, which means any force I put on the handle is going to go directly in line, ideal for a stab. A little bit of an upsweep is not necessarily a bad thing. The point, and actually this point is still fairly in line with the handle, but if it were to be a little higher, it's not going to hurt a lot. In a saber type stab, you're starting to get more off center, which means the pressure, you've got more of the blade that's trying to penetrate at any given moment, so it's going to take more pressure to penetrate, and it gets far enough off, it's going to start to torque as you hit things. Now this is fine in a hammer grip because it's following the curve of the stab. In an ice pick grip, again, it's following the curve of the stab, so the point being a little above the handle is not really too big an issue. Now, we get the point starts dropping below the handle, it becomes nearly impossible, especially if you don't have a sharpened false edge. It becomes nearly impossible to stab with. This thing, you're now limiting your technique considerably. Stabs are just about out. Slashes, maybe chops, although with something this small, that's going to be somewhat limiting. So you start to limit your techniques. Now the edges. There's an advantage to having double edge. You can execute techniques with either edge, either side of the blade, and it aids in penetration. You get a single edge blade that does not have a sharpened false edge. That's, again, going to make penetration more difficult. Not impossible, but more difficult. And in a fighting knife, there's no real advantage to that. You may as well get a sharpened edge on the backside. So this one, this is a pretty good compromise between a straight up dagger and then something with a single edge. So I've got a single edge here, and then I do have a sharpened false edge. This allows me to do, again, back cuts. I can cut with the back of the blade, and it aids in penetration a bit. Now, a straight edge is, again, fine for stabbing. If you're going to chop or slice with it, slicing is not too bad. Chopping, what's happening is you've got more of the edge coming in contact with the target at any given moment, which means your penetration is going to be take a little more force. Get something with a curve to it. Now, as you're either chopping with it or slicing with it, you've actually got a smaller part of the blade contacting the target at any given moment, which means it's going to cut much easier because you've got, you've got a much smaller. It's like trying to penetrate something with a needle versus a golf ball. Yeah, the less that is in contact at any given moment, the less actual flesh you're cutting at any given moment, and so it makes the cut easier, either in a slice or in a chop. Now, what kind of edge you put on the blade is important as well. So we've got convex, concave, and varying degrees, either single or double bevels. In a fighting knife, you don't need a lot of support for the edge at any given moment because you're not going to continue to use it. If you damage the edge, it's not a big deal. It's not like your working blade where if you damage it, the damage, eventually you're going to have to stop and redress the edge or whatever. Now, the convex or Appleseed or Moran edge, I like that in most of my knives. I like them in a field knife. Comes up like an Appleseed. There's a lot of support for the edge, and yet you can get quite a good edge on it. This is good for a working knife where you're constantly working with it. You don't have to sharpen it nearly as frequently. Now, again, just like with a point, it does limit your cutting ability just a little bit. Whereas if you get something with a hollow grind, where it comes together like a razor, you've got that hollow grind. So it's coming together with an inward curve. You can see that edge is much more exposed. Makes it much finer edge for cutting, but it's got less mechanical support. Again, in a fighting knife, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You're not going to be constantly cutting with it to the point where when you get enough edge damage, you're going to have to stop and redress the edge. It's going to be extremely limited use before you have to deal with the edge. Now we do have, for example, this one. This is a straight up angle grind, and you get a couple of different kinds. You get with one side, and you'll see this on cheaper blades, although again it doesn't matter, or you get it on both sides, and it's the angle of the blade that's going to determine, again, how sharp it is, how tough it is. Too little of an angle and the edge won't hold up. Too much of an angle, like you'd find on an axe blade, the edge is quite strong, but actually slicing with it because you've got more blade coming in contact at any given moment, it makes it a little harder to slice with. So if you're going to have a bevel grind, again, either single bevel or double bevel, you're probably going to want more of an angle on a fighting knife than you would on a working blade. And then just maintain your edge. It's not a big deal. So let's see what we're looking at. Okay, curved edge, straight edge. Okay, so that's about it. So what we're generally looking for is anywhere from 4 to maybe, like I said, I like 8 inches. Anything bigger than 9 inches tends to be a bit unwieldy. You want to think about curves. Curves on the blade. For example, this is very, very straight. The Applegate Fairbairn or the Gerber, they put some curve into the blade, made it a little more useful for slashing, although it does, again, make the penetration a little less. This was designed primarily as a killing knife. All you're looking for is penetration. The actual slashing with it, slicing with it, much less important. So as we're looking at the blade geometry and weight, where does the weight? This thing is very point heavy. This one is very point light. Again, in a chop, that's important. In a stab, not so much. How does it affect your wound channel, and how does it affect your techniques? This is extraordinarily limited. About all you can do with it is slash. This, I can chop. It's got enough weight to chop with it. I can slice with it. I can stab with it. I can slash with it. It's got a little bit of a curve on the primary edge. It does have a back edge, so I can make back cuts with it, whereas with a single edge blade, it does not have a sharpened false edge. This would be a heck of a chopper, but coming back this way, it becomes an impact weapon. So you look at the balance, you try it in your hands. How does it feel? Try applying it, do your test cutting, try applying the force to a target. How does it fit your technique? How does it fit your philosophy in knife fighting, for example? If you don't think you're ever going to use an ice pick or reverse grip, then something like this is going to be of limited use, especially with the teeth on the back. You might be better off with something like this. Or if you don't think you're ever going to use a stab, you can use something different, something closer to this. Although, as I said, this is primarily a woodworking tool, not a fighting knife. But the weight, the length, the blade, what sharp edges are where, how does the point line up, and that's all very personal. And the thing to do is try some different blades, try them out with the different techniques, especially with test cutting, see what works for you, and then just pick and choose what it is that works for you, for the techniques you're using, for the damage you're trying to do, and just for your personal feel.